Welcome back to another session. I hope you are well. In today's session, I am going to be speaking to the theme, which is the challenge to succeed. Um, a conversation I began as an introduction, dealing with men or men's issues, specifically in relation to um, uh, something that we've heard a lot more of, which is the word beta and the reference to beta males. Now, I termed what will be a series of sessions as the challenge to succeed for a number of reasons. Firstly, um, there's always a call that we all have, men and women, to become our best selves. That is a challenge. It's an adventure, a call to adventure, but a challenge nonetheless. A call to adventure where you will meet with challenges, but for which the obstacles are not there to stop you. They are there to make you better. The purpose and the ultimate goal or intention is to transform yourself from who you are presently to who you should be, to maximize that potential that is within you, to become the best version of yourself that you can manage. The conversations I have covered over the many weeks and months have primarily dealt with relationships and intersexual dynamics. Now, within relational discussions, the word beta, when used towards men, is so often used in a pejorative sense, or used in a sense where perhaps it's an homonym. It's not seen as a positive statement. I'm going to put aside my position and what I think about that word, especially with reference to men. I have used the word in a few sessions, and I've used it to describe men who perhaps never became their full self. Now, the session I started yesterday, or 2 days ago, I explained that if you look at the Greek language and look at the word beta, it denotes second place. I used the example of computers to explain that a software once completed or once designed beyond the concept stage. In the first version, it's called beta. Sometimes it is released to a selected few in order to test, to improve prior to the final release. So when we talk about beta males, and we use the word beta for men, we are simply saying men who have not become the full expression of what should be masculinity or manhood. Perhaps they haven't been allowed, or they have refused the opportunity to transcend and to move from male to boyhood to manhood to being a gentleman. They've stayed stuck in a particular, you might say, phase of their lives. And that could be as a result of various causes. In any case, what I hope today's session will provide is perhaps a way of understanding if you are a man, understanding perhaps, evaluating perhaps where you stand. And if you are a woman, use it as an opportunity to evaluate the kind of man that you seem to be attracting, or that you are in a relationship with, or perhaps that you would like. Remember, there is not one size that fits everyone. Now, let me begin by making a few, general, I'm going to throw what I call thought triggers, so you can understand what I share in the next, say, half an hour. I'll start with the first, which is, it's important to separate men into two sections, purposefully stated that way, because when I talk about men, obviously I'm not talking about all men. All refers to 100%. When I say most, to be in the most, you need just to be the majority, which is 50.1%, and that will put you in the majority. when we look at men, roughly we have about perhaps 3.6, 3.5 billion men in the world. So this conversation does not apply to every man. I'm making broad generalizations about men, but it's important for me to separate two separate camps. Depending on where you are in the world and depending on where you were born, where you were raised, and where you currently reside, your environment and your biology have had an impact on your behavior. That is just the standard given. Environment and your innate biological makeup influences your behavior. I like to distinguish men into two groups: modern men and traditional men. Now, this is important for the whole beta conversation. If you are in the West, I consider you, especially if you were born post, say, if you're a baby boomer, Generation X, millennial, Generation Z, or A, you are within what I call modern men. So from 1960s. Technically speaking, the baby boom generation began in 1945. However, at the point where people turned 18 and became chronologically adults, most people tend to choose a fixed concept between 18 years and 21, whatever ideology or whatever social acceptable mores and decorum that is present at the time is adopted by the individual and almost sunk into their subconscious mind. So although the baby boom generation goes back as 1945, from 1960, that's when we started to see a lot of the liberal ideas that we see in the West, most of it. And that played a huge role in people's psychology, in our social engagements, and culturally where we are in the West. Now, when I talk about the West, I'm really speaking about part of what you might call the Anglosphere, Great Britain or the United Kingdom, the United States of America, Canada, or Northern America, if you combine both, places like Australia, places like parts of Europe, not the Slavic or the Baltic countries, but Western Europe, and a few other places. Those are places that have accepted certain, you might say, elements of what was part of the gifts that came from the old British Empire. We have the likes of Western civilization, partly the Judeo-Christian values, the Enlightenment, separation between church and state, and all the various benefits and derivatives that came from that time. Modern, traditional. If you are in the West, I put you in the camp of being a modern man. If you were born, raised in any other part of the world, outside of the West, I put you in, generally speaking, the majority are traditional. Now, to expand this further, it's important for me to bring in Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Very important for today's conversation, but also for the sessions that might follow. Many years ago, Maslow came up with what I think was a breakthrough in trying to understand psychology, human interactions, and most important, our motivations. And he came up with something called the pyramid. He called that pyramid a hierarchy of needs. At the bottom of the pyramid was what he termed our physiological needs. Next was our safety and security needs. And then you had others. But to make it more simple, at the bottom, in terms of physiological needs, the need for food, the need for shelter, and the need for water are basic, very basic needs. Above that is the safety and security needs. The need to feel safe and the need to be secure. Above that, you have what we call the need for love and belonging, to feel part of a community. Next, you have what we call self-esteem, and finally, self-actualization. Now, this is key, irrespective of where you are in the world. The reason being, every one of us, we progress from the bottom and we journey towards the top being self-actualization. Now, there is a correlation, and the correlation is very, very high between where you are as a society or as a nation and your economic wealth, and where you will find yourself in that pyramid. So we go back, hence me starting with the baby boomers. In terms of generations, we have the Great Generation, 1900, all the way up to about 1928, 29. From 29 up until 44, you have what we call the Silent Generation. In the West, these two generations saw wars. At the turn of the 20th century, the life expectancy for the average person was about 40 years, if you were lucky. Prior to that, women started childbirth at roughly 13, and before they got to 33, they were either dead or they'd had so many complications. If they had 6 or 7 kids, about 80% of those died, and the rest that remained, half of those died before their 11th birthday. Things were hard, very hard. Based on how we live, even in the West, the average person lived on less than $1 per day, a number considered by the UN as poverty. People were generally poor. The Great Generation focused on simply food and staying alive. But as we transitioned and we moved into the Industrial Revolution, I'm talking about in this particular instance, not the original revolution, but the 3 technologies that combined: electricity, the automobile, and the technology that we saw as a result of development, including the genomics, advances in biology and our understanding of our biome and our genome, and actually the development of things like antibiotics. The point I'm making is this: we saw a change between the Great and the Silent Generation that we had never seen before. We had 2 world wars, and the focus then was all about, could we survive? Safety, survival, and our basic needs. So if you were born in that area and in that time, all you focused on was staying alive and surviving. Now, what this meant was that on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you were at the bottom. Post the Second World Wars and the Treaty of Versailles, things were settled and there was relative peace and there was relative safety for a long period of time. And what that did, especially if you were in the West, particularly the United States, there was a boom. The rebuilding of countries, the advancement of several technologies, people started to look towards a brighter future. The baby boomers were born 1945, and by the time they got to about 1820, we started to think less about war and we started to think more about self and love. Now we move to the next third stage or the third level of Maslow's hierarchy of need: love and belonging, and self-esteem. So the baby boom generation were the first generation that started to birth people, children that focused on themselves. So baby boom and my generation, Generation X, have done more damage to the fabric of society than any of the generations previously. Why? Because for the first time in history, we stopped focusing on food and water and shelter and survival and security, because we had solved the issue about peace. We had peace in the West. Now, I'm speaking specifically about the West. What this simply means is if you are baby boom, Generation X, or any of the generation that succeeded Generation X, you are a modern man and you are a modern woman. And you have had, perhaps exception being those in parts of Ukraine or parts of Russia that are having an altercation, you haven't seen wars. And so we talk about first world problems in the West because we do not have issues about survival, security, and food and shelter. We've solved the issue of the 2 bottom rows of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And we're advancing, therefore, and we're staying, firstly, in love and belonging, self-esteem, and we're moving to a self-actualization. Apologize for the long explanation, but I think it's important. Now, with that backdrop, Now let me move back to the whole thing about beta males, so you can understand why I went through the process of having to explain this whole concept. If you are a modern man, meaning you were born in the West, from my estimation, and this is an estimation I haven't made without consideration and regard, I actually believe that there is an 80-20 split amongst men in the West, modern men. 80% of most men were raised and have, whether you're baby boom, generation X, millennial, generation Z, and A, 80% of men will fall within, as a default position, of having traits that are beta. 20% of men will fall within men who have traits that are more traditional in the West. So it's an 80-20 split. So what this simply means is that on a balance of probabilities, if you are a man in the West, born in the West, if I was going to roll a dice and you said to me, there's a man coming into the house, what do you believe his composition would be? Would he be a fully formed man, or would he be more of a beta male? I would say, on a balance of probabilities, 8 out of 10 times, he will be a beta male. He will be wearing the avatar of a beta male. Why? Several reasons. Since the baby boom generation, what we've seen is the disintegration of families, family values, and the importance of families. In the UK, as of 2023, for women below the age of 40, about 60%, 55 to about 60 plus percent, the data still continues to come through, of said women, and this number is trending. Although we are still in 2023, the data update is saying the number is trending towards 70% and even more of women 40 and below are having children with no fathers. No father involvement, and certainly no father involvement beyond age 4 or 5. For 35 and below, the number is 70. For 30 and below, the number is roughly 80. So we are raising children without fathers. Therefore, most young people are being raised into what I would call a gynocentric society, where everything is revolves around the needs of a woman and keeping a woman happy. The whole idea, happy wife, happy life, started with the baby boom generation, and it's got worse since then. So most men were not raised with strong masculine fathers or men in the communities. Number two, there was a time when we lived in communities. We haven't lived in communities in the same level since the 1950s, 1960s. People go to college and they leave their local small villages, their towns, their cities, and they go to bigger places. So what we find is that we are no longer living in communities. We're living as isolated people. The replacement rate of children in the UK is less than what should be the 2.1, which is the minimum required to maintain the population size. So most people are having one child. And what that simply means is most people are not being socialized. You have family, no fathers, one child or more. And so many families where you have an only child, and that only child is not being socialized across the community because people are moving and no longer staying together as one. And what this simply means is, if you combine what I would call the genetic lottery, referencing where you were born. I'm not making a value judgment, just referencing where you were born. 80% of the men in the West who were born to what I would call the modern West, 80% of those by default will have a beta frame in terms of masculinity. 20% will have a traditional, more upright frame of masculinity. Now, in addition to that, what you find is that we're not socializing kids. There are no fathers in the communities. Most children are being raised by mothers. The media, our local associations tell us that everything revolves around the woman. Since the 1970s, we've had an attack on masculinity and manhood so strong that most young boys feel ashamed to call themselves men. We can see this in performance in education, performance, testosterone level. We can see this in every single measurement criteria in the West. Boys are doing poorly compared to girls in roughly 52 of the 56 developed countries in the world. Boys are failing. Why? Fatherlessness and the attack of masculinity. So most boys were raised under one of three possible arrangements. They were raised without fathers, which is the default for most people. Number two, they were raised with fathers, but their fathers did not have their own fathers present. So in many ways, they were raised with fathers in the household, but their fathers were feminized. Why? They had no relationship with their own father. So their grandfathers were absent, their fathers were feminized, and therefore very soft, and these soft men raised their sons. And what you've seen is a transfer of an archetype from one generation to another. Number three, they were raised with fathers, and they were raised with fathers who had the traditional masculine frame. Now, unfortunately, the third is a minority, so small that it becomes statistically almost insignificant. Now, everything I'm sharing so far, and everything that I share about relationships on my channel, if you are a modern man, your natural inclination is to resist or to find everything I say to be offensive. That is why, probably because that is the reason for that is because you are most likely operating on a feminine software. If you are a woman, your natural instinct is to think of what I share to be sexist, misogynistic, narcissistic, and any other pejorative statements, words used to describe men who have standards. Young men are being raised under one of three possible arrangements. No fathers, the majority. I would say this will account for about 70-80%. Fathers, but feminine fathers, which would account for roughly, in my opinion, maybe about 15%. And 2 to 3% will be where there is a father, but of a masculine frame. Now, can you see that we started with 80% of men in the West will be wearing a beta frame, and 20 potentially could be wearing a traditional conservative or a fixed frame of what it means to be a man. Of the small group, we put that aside because that is quite little. We focus on the 80% and we simply say, look at yourself and ask yourself a simple question. Were you raised with no father, a father that is feminine, and a mother therefore who is masculine? Or were you raised in a two-parent family where your father wore the masculine avatar and played the masculine role, and your mother wore the feminine avatar and played the feminine role? Now, establishing that is key because you don't need me to tell you what the traits of a beta male is. You simply have to ask yourself a question. Has my environment created an inevitable archetype that I have wore and I have been wearing subconsciously up until today? Now, let me move the conversation quickly to relationships, because when we talk about beta, I have to make it very clear. I'm not saying those who are beta males are not competent and are not intelligent. I'm not suggesting that they're not men who are assertive. I'm not suggesting that these are not men who haven't made an impact and will not make an impact on the world. I'm simply saying within the area of relationships, we find that it would be similar to a software that wasn't completed, and therefore it's in a state that we call a second class state to what should be a first class expectation. If you are a young man, when I was growing up, I don't know about you, but young men were given what I call the 3 S's, a way of actually measuring our performance: sports, success, and sex. Sports was a way of showing how we were different from other men. So we played games and we got involved with sports. The more you got involved with group sports, or sports involving 1 or 2 people, the less likely that you were going to stick in that beta frame. Why? You got the socialization that was robbed, or that you were robbed of, by virtue of having no father or a feminine father. By going into sports, you had the opportunity to be around coaches who disciplined you. So for example, if you got involved in rough and tumble play, some form of martial arts, if you joined the scouts, if you took risks, what you found was that you were under the tutelage of a coach, and therefore you had a frame that you were looking up to, someone who was assertive, kind, loving, but set boundaries, and you followed the boundaries. So therefore sports was a way of young men showing how they were different, how we were unique from the man or the boy standing next to us. I'm talking about group sports or sports involving other people. And if you played any form of sports and combined that with some form of martial arts, you developed an understanding of the male psyche. You regulated your emotions, you understood testosterone, and you knew how to control your environment, either by your words, by your presence, or by your actions. Success was therefore education. So 1 was sports, 2nd was success, but that was primarily education, or whatever vocational aspect of education you use as a substitute. So if we did well in school, we succeeded. Now we did the first 2 to be able to find women or girls, for girls to find us attractive. And what we found was that if we were good in sports and we were good in education, academically, the women in the same group, either in the same class as you, would have noticed you. So if you had an interest in sports and you had a frame, a build that was attractive, in other words, you worked out, then you would have had an attractive frame for a man. If you were good in sports, then you would have drawn attention to yourself. And if you were good academically, you would have been considered to be perhaps one of the people with high potential amongst all the men. That would have meant that you would have found that from a young age, you would have been socialized, both socially, romantically, but with the opposite sex. And this is where it becomes key. You would have developed a frame about who you were. And sports and education would have given you a purpose, because at that age, you may not have understood your true ultimate purpose. And sports and education would have been your focus. When women came along, they would have occupied perhaps the 3rd or the 4th position. You were first, your education was 2nd, sports was 3rd, and if a girl came into your life, she was 4th. Now what this simply meant was that you were not subservient to the feminine prowess or power. You knew who you were, and you were confident and happy in yourself. Now, if you did not get into any of sports, but you were good in education, but you didn't socialize, and you came from single parent family or a 2-parent family with a feminine father, what you would have found was that you would have been socially awkward around girls. What we found since the 1960s is that we raised a generation of softer men and harder women. And these are men who tend to have more female friends, because mum was seen as the idol and the one who you could go to with your emotional problems. And therefore, as you grew as a boy with no father available, or because your father didn't allow you to emote to him, you found that you couldn't confide in men. And these are boys who grew up around women who you would ask who were your best friends, and they would say girls, not boys, because they couldn't socialize with boys who were more masculine. Some of these boys never got into sports, and therefore they became very feminine. They saw women, they pedestalized girls. And that carried on until they became adults and they pedestalize women. Now, I don't believe women are more superior to men. And I don't believe men are more superior to women. I think superiority and inferiority are opposite sides of a coin, and the coin is a counterfeit. The point I am making is about understanding who you are as a man and being comfortable in yourself. And people who we consider as beta, generally speaking, are people who, from a masculinity perspective, are not completely cooked. It hasn't cooked completely. The software didn't complete. It was put out to the public before it was completed. And so you find socially, and from a romantic or relational perspective, these men struggle. Some of these men failed the journey. Now, I have said before, you're born a male. You develop into being a boy. You move forward as part of further development and awareness and hard work into being a man. But you are crafted into being a gentleman. Beta males are usually, and there are cases where you find gentlemen who are still beta, and you find men who are still beta, and you find boys who are still beta. It's not about your development from a position of awareness or intellectually or success generally in terms of wealth or education. Is that your software is feminine. So when we talk about beta males, these are men who run on a feminine software, or men who pedestalize women so much so that they would do anything because they have no sense of security in themselves. Now let me expand this further, and I'm going to bring today's session to a close very shortly. I talk about two separate marketplaces. This is very key to understand beta. Dating marketplace and the relationship marketplace. In the dating marketplace, men, generally speaking, are looking for fun. So, primarily sex. For men, dating is synonymous with sex. In the relationship marketplace, which is more long-term relationship, people are looking for something more. Intimacy or long-term relationship. In the first marketplace, dating, women control the balance of power. Women are gatekeepers to their body, their emotions, and their womb. So a woman decides when sex begins, or when intimacy begins, or who she reproduces for. The woman decides, her body, her choice. Because men primarily want sex, we have to play the dance that women can accept. Therefore, the woman, generally speaking, controls the leverage of power. The younger we are, the less we have to bring to the table to negotiate. The older we are, the more leverage we have. And while she might be the one who actually in the dating marketplace still calls the shots, we still feel confident because maybe we have resources as a fair exchange. In the relationship marketplace, men are gatekeepers. We decide who we go on one knees for, both knees for, or no knees for. The relationship begins when the man decides it begins. I give you my last name. I invite you to join my family. I accept all of the liabilities of marriage. The family court system, appalling. But a man says, do you know what? I will get married. I'll cohabit with you. We'll go into civil partnership, despite all of the disadvantages. Despite me knowing that half of the marriages or civil partnerships will end within 7 years. And in 7 times out of 10, the woman is the one leaving. And in the remaining 3 out of 10, half of those, she's the one demanding he files for the divorce. So in 8.5 out of 10, she walks away. When she walks away, I lose half my wealth. If we have children and we go to the family court system, which is like a mafia, 9 out of 10 times, she gets custody. And a man looks at all of those and simply says, I still want to go ahead. So we are gatekeepers in relationships, primarily because we bear a heavier penalty if things go awry. Women pay a heavier penalty in the dating marketplace if things go wrong. You meet a guy, he sleeps with you and moves on. You're giving yourself to someone too soon. You meet a guy, you sleep with him too early, you get pregnant, and he moves on. Now you're paying a heavy penalty for reproduction. So the gatekeeping function in the two marketplaces determines who has the balance and leverage of power. Now, it's important to understand what I say next. In dating, if men are there primarily for sex, then men do not really care who they have sex with. A man will date someone who is a 10 or a 9 in beauty for sex, but he would also sleep with someone who is a 1 or a 2 because he has a need for ejaculation. And because men do not have an emotional connection with ejaculation or sex the way women do, for us it's like having a piss. Ejaculation is like urination from a man's perspective. And what that simply means, when it comes to dating, it doesn't really matter because all he wants to do is ejaculate. And that simply means it doesn't matter who the vessel that enables him to achieve that desire. In relationship, however, considering all the liabilities surrounding marriage, cohabitation, civil partnership, men are more careful. Now here is where I bring in beta to relationships in a way that I think perhaps you might remember. If you are successful as a man, you have gain. If you're young, or you have success academically, although that is not found to be an attractive quality amongst young girls, but you're into sports, you're good looking, you have a nice frame, and you're socially not awkward. Key point, you're socially adept, you're socially aware, you understand how to carry yourself. So you're successful, you play football, you play basketball, you're doing well. Women will be around you. And so you learn how to flirt with intention and how to flirt with purpose. You learn how to be around women. Now, if you were raised around women, but you were raised with a masculine father, you learn about the masculine role and how the masculine frame is something to be proud of. You were not raised just around women. And if you were lucky and not had a feminine mother who raised you to be a softer man, then you have confidence and a sense of purpose in who you are. So even in the dating marketplace, when you go out for sex, you don't do everything and anything just to have sex. You have standards. So you can always say, do you know what? I'll let it pass. The key distinction, and if you go back to a video I did, I said you have to learn how to be indifferent towards sex. You want it, but you don't want it at any price. Why? During intercourse and sex, a woman has the same opportunity for an orgasm and to have fun as you do. So while she controls the leverage, it doesn't mean it's a negative sum game. It's a positive sum experience because she gets the pleasure just as you do. So you're not taking something from her. And therefore, men who have the right frame can very well say, well, fuck off. I want it, but I don't want it that badly. Men who have not been socialized and who are driven by the need to ejaculate are more likely to do things that deviate from what a man should do just to make a woman happy. This is where they start to behave and act as allies to women and even preach against what should be a traditional male frame. Why? Because you're so desperate and you have no success and you have no game and you have no what I'll call physique to attract women. So you do any and everything. And most importantly, you were raised in a feminine software installation. So you pedestalize women so much so that you would do anything and everything. Now you have money, wealth, you have education, but you lack the masculine frame because you were not raised around men. And you don't have an essence of what it means to be a man. So in the dating marketplace, you find that the prevalence of beta males, whilst they might be present, is worse in the relationship marketplace. Why? Because in the relationship marketplace, you should have made something of yourself. I usually talk about 35 as the age that men should start to tolerate relationships, which would mean at 35 you've achieved something, you've made something of yourself, you have success financially, professionally, or perhaps even you have discovered your purpose. So you have a sense of who you are. The younger you are, you come first, your education comes second, sports comes third, and the woman comes fourth. The older you are, your purpose comes first, you come second, your work comes third, she comes fourth. So you're always placing the woman not at the number one position. You're not pedestalizing the woman. You're putting your purposes first. And then you second. Beta males are those who put women as first. And they are second. In any relationship, a woman who is placed as first, the man in that position is a beta male. It doesn't matter how successful he might be financially or academically. In his mindset, it's a mindset thing relationally. If you pedestalize women, you have a feminine installation, and most likely you will be beta. Now, the key part is the relationship phase, because the man should have the leverage of power. So when you find men who've had sex with women and continue to pursue women in a feminine frame, where the woman takes the masculine position or the number one position, recognizing that this is relationship now, not sex. We've had sex. But you continue to pedestalize her despite moving into the relationship phase, where she should be the one asking for the relationship. But instead, you are the one asking and begging for the relationship with her. You're in the beta phase. So men who, generally speaking, will date women and wait for 2 years or 3 years, hoping that she says, we're now officially boyfriend and girlfriend, you're in a beta phase. You're in a beta software. So what is running through you is feminine and is beta. Men who wear the masculine frame and who have an idea of their purpose and who are leading and living a purpose-driven life and who are confident and who are happy and who place themselves as first and who do not pedestalize women are seldom in a beta phase, irrespective of their economic or academic success. Now, we'll go back to when I started. I said, in the West, 80% of men, by default, are running on the beta software. Now, in other parts of the world, the traditional countries, 80% up to 90% of men, by default, are in a masculine frame. And you will find roughly, sometimes between 10 and 20% are in a feminine beta frame. A big difference. So modern men who are indifferent towards sex, modern men who are in a relationship where his purpose is number one, his character is built on that purpose, his accomplishments, his success, his pursuits are built on the same foundation, will always stay in the masculine frame. Now let me close with an example. And I think this is important because here we combine 3 different belief systems. We thank Moses for the Torah, Muhammad for the Quran, and in many ways the Christian doctrine by Jesus, which encompasses the foundation stone, which is the Old Testament. This is a story. You don't have to believe it. But what you see is a blueprint of what a man should have as a frame. The garden is created. Man is placed in the garden, and he is given instructions to maintain, to protect, to cultivate, to make everything around him better. They are the animals, name the animals. And he's thriving, and then the woman is introduced into his life. And he's so busy in his purpose, on his grind, naming the animals, playing with the animals, he doesn't even know that he needs a companion. He has to be interrupted. And then when he sees the word, he says, oh, woman. Now I want to connect myself. I want to leave and cleave with this woman. Now the point of all of that is to simply say, his purpose was given to him. His work, the task, was known, and he was operating, focused on his purpose, administering the tasks for which he was given before the woman came into his life. Men, generally speaking, who do not have a sense of purpose and who are not living a purpose-driven life, who do not have a level of focus and who were not built on a masculine frame by default, 80% of said men will wear a beta frame. The question, therefore, is, as I conclude, is, let's assume you fall within the category of 80%. What can you do about it? I can't cover that in this session. I hope what I've covered so far has not been too hard to listen to. If it has, perhaps there's something you can take away. Someone else may have been responsible for the installation software that operates and runs your life. But from now, going forward, you can make a change. You do not have to live the same way, running on the same software installation that you have been running. If you fall within the 80% group, you can change. And that change comes and begins with one word: awareness of the reality. So I'd like you to go away and audit yourself as a man and as a woman, audit the men around you, and put them into camps. See what you observe based on what I've shared. Now, I hope today's session has been interesting.